in 1347, this microscopic bacterium, right, Yersinia pestis, it arrives on the shores of Europe.
The bubonic plague.
Exactly, the Black Death. And over the next few years, it wiped out like roughly 50% of the continent's population.
Which is an apocalyptic level of suffering.
Yeah, unimaginable horror. But the thing is, the survivors of that, they didn't demand safe spaces. They eventually went on to build a renaissance.
Right, they pushed through it.
Right. But fast forward to today, you have a major journalistic institution deciding the word riot is too stigmatizing to use when describing literal burning buildings.
Yeah, and society just complies.
Literally just complies. So how did we go from surviving the Black Death to, a culture that demands this totally frictionless, emotionally sanitized existence?
Where did the psychological armor actually go?
Exactly. And that's what we're looking at today. We're undoing an exclusive review of a highly controversial, ultra-incisive new ebook that is making massive waves by asking those exact questions.
It's a heavy one.
It really is. Whether you're looking to understand the history of our institutions before they were fundamentally changed, or, if you are deeply embedded in the men's rights and red-pilled manosphere communities, this deep dive is an absolute must listen.
Absolutely.
But hey, before we jump into the deep end, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show. And I want to explicitly mention right at the top that if you want to follow along with us, you can buy this fascinating ebook right now.
Highly recommend grabbing it.
Yeah, just check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. The book is called Patrician Mind, Restoring Classical Foundations of Order in a Society Gone Completely Mad. And it's by Conrad Riker.
Yeah, and before we really get going, I need to jump in here, because this book contains highly politically charged content regarding feminism, Marxism, and the culture wars. We must be clear, like crystal clear.
Right.
We are absolutely not taking sides.
None at all.
Our mission today is purely to impartially report on the contents of the author's work, dissecting his historical and philosophical arguments so you can understand this perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
We are doing this without us endorsing the viewpoints. We're just the messengers mapping out the architecture of Riker's claims.
That is the perfect framing for this. I mean, our goal is to really just deconstruct Riker's core thesis, which is, well, he's essentially arguing that classical Western foundations offer a blueprint.
Right, drawing on Aristotelian logic,
Yeah.
Roman Stoicism, early Enlightenment thinkers.
Yeah, and he views this as a psychological blueprint specifically for men to reclaim their mental bandwidth, right? Reclaiming personal sovereignty in what he characterizes as a collapsing, emotionally driven society.
Collapsing is the key word for him.
Totally. Reading through the initial chapters, I was trying to visualize what he actually means by this mental drain. And instead of the old cliche of, clearing malware off a slow computer.
Yeah, everyone uses that one.
Right, but he makes it feel more like a besieged fortress. Like the guards, our mental faculties are exhausted from constantly chasing phantom shadows in the forest outside the walls.
Well, the main gates are just left wide open.
Exactly. So is he basically saying our biology is fundamentally mismatched for the modern environment?
That besieged fortress analogy captures his premise perfectly. I mean, Riker grounds his entire philosophy in evolutionary biology.
Okay.
Specifically, he focuses on the human prefrontal cortex. To really understand his argument, you have to look at the environment where our neurological hardware was forged.
The Pleistocene savannah.
Yes.
Yeah.
In that environment, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for, complex planning, decision-making, social behavior, it evolved to track a very specific set of variables.
Like highly localized stuff.
Exactly localized. We are talking about maybe 3 to 5 immediate existential threats at any given time.
Right, like a predator hiding in the tall grass.
Yeah, or a rival tribe encroaching on your territory, or just the immediate threat of starvation, finding shelter from a storm.
So things you can physically interact with.
Yes, the brain's threat detection system was optimized for physical realities you could see, touch, and practically respond to.
Meaning there's a direct link between the threat and an actionable physical response. Like you see the lion, you run or fight.
And then the loop closes.
The loop closes, exactly.
And that closed loop is essential. The biological stress response, so, the spike in cortisol, the rush of adrenaline, it was designed to be acute and temporary.
Not constant.
Right. The hardware was built to process localized danger, resolve it, and then return to a baseline state. But Riker argues that today, we are forcing that identical Pleistocene hardware to run a software program it physically cannot handle.
Because of the internet.
Exactly. When you wake up and grab your smartphone, you are instantly mainlining the aggregated algorithmically amplified suffering, outrage, and crises of 8 billion strangers.
8 billion. It's just nuts to think about.
You are exposed to global economic shifts, distant wars, social media outrage cycles, all before your feet even touch the floor.
Yeah, and Riker calls the modern demand that an individual must care about every global issue, what was it? A neurological impossibility.
Yes, a neurological impossibility that induces pathological collapse.
Pathological collapse. He backs that up by talking about allostatic load. Can we break down the actual mechanism of what's happening to the body there?
Yeah, we should.
Because it's not just a feeling of being overwhelmed, right? He's claiming there's a measurable physiological degradation happening to you.
Allostatic load is a really critical concept in his framework. It basically refers to the cumulative physiological wear and tear on the body's systems caused by chronic, unresolvable stress.
Unresolvable being the key.
Right. When you are exposed to a localized threat on the savannah, your body marshals its resources. But when you're exposed to what Riker calls the fabricated emotional burdens of a declining civilization.
Wow.
Yeah, on a 247 news cycle, your brain literally cannot distinguish between a digital threat and a physical one.
So it reacts like the lion is always there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your body stays in a constant low-grade state of fight or flight. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, remains chronically elevated.
And when cortisol stays high, it suppresses other stuff, right?
Yes, it actively suppresses other biological functions. Most notably, for Riker's argument regarding men, chronic cortisol elevation actively suppresses the production of testosterone.
Wait, really? So the continuous exposure to, like, global panic on Twitter is literally altering a man's endocrinology.
According to Riker's interpretation of the biology, yes.
That's wild. So the stress is stripping away the biological drivers of assertion and risk-taking.
He argues that this chronic overload strips a man of his biological capacity to lead, to build, or to impose order on his environment. The allostatic load exhausts the prefrontal cortex, leading to systemic fatigue.
So you just burn out?
Yeah. The result is not an engaged citizen, but a compliant, flaccid consumer who lacks the biological drive to assert sovereignty over his own life.
Wow. Okay, so if our energy is being drained by this macro stress, how are we spending whatever little mental bandwidth we have left?
Riker pivots here to what he calls the illusion of infinite choice.
Yeah, I was completely thrown by the specific data he pulls regarding modern dating apps, specifically Tinder.
Oh yeah, he goes hard on that.
He frames it as a massive energy sink.
He uses Tinder as the prime example of what he terms the tyranny of choice. To understand the metabolic cost here, we have to look at the numbers he provides.
Lay them out for us.
Tinder alone processes roughly 1.5 billion swipes every single day.
1.5 billion. Every day.
Every single day. And Riker frames this platform not as a tool for connection, but as the ultimate illusion of infinite sexual and romantic options.
He calls it an endless digital slot machine, right?
Yes, operating on a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. It's the exact same psychological mechanism that keeps gamblers pulling the lever, hoping for a jackpot.
But unlike a slot machine where you lose money, here you're losing cognitive resources.
Exactly.
Because every swipe is a micro decision. You're evaluating a face, a bio, social status, all in a fraction of a second. I imagine that requires a massive amount of glucose for the brain to process.
It does. The brain utilizes glucose for executive decision-making, forcing the prefrontal cortex to make micro-evaluations on 50 different human beings in the span of 3 minutes violently drains those metabolic resources.
Violently drains them. That's a great way to put it.
And Riker argues that this system reduces both men and women to disposable commodities. But he specifically argues it traps men in a state of perpetual glucose-depleted inertia.
And the actual sociological outcome of all this swiping, does it lead to better matches or more relationships?
The measurable real-world consequence Riker cites is that marriage and long-term commitment rates have plummeted by 40% since 2013.
Wait, 40% since 2013?
Yeah, which is the era when these apps truly took over. He argues that the brain simply gives up under the weight of infinite options.
So the abundance doesn't create satisfaction?
No, it doesn't create optimization either. In Riker's framework, it creates anthropological paralysis.
Anthropological paralysis.
The man is so exhausted by the illusion of choice that he commits to nothing, builds nothing, and remains perpetually stalled.
Okay, so if the digital environment is actively eroding our neurobiology and paralyzing us, how is a person actually supposed to operate?
And answer that, Riker goes back into history, specifically leaning on Stoicism, and the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, let's get into Marcus Aurelius because Riker uses him as the ultimate historical blueprint for cognitive triage under existential pressure.
And it's vital to understand the context of Aurelius's reign, right?
Yeah.
From 165 to 180 AD, the Roman Empire was absolutely devastated by the Antonine Plague.
Which is brutal.
Modern historians estimate it killed anywhere from 5 to 10 million people. The Roman legions were decimated, the economy was in free fall. The known world was quite literally teetering on the edge of total systemic collapse.
And Marcus Aurelius is the most powerful man on the planet during this time. He is the emperor. You would assume the psychological weight of millions of his citizens dying would be completely crushing.
You would think so.
Like the macro stress we talked about earlier should have destroyed him.
But Riker points to the emperor's private journal, Meditations, which Aurelius wrote during military campaigns on the frontier while the plague raged.
All right.
And if you read those texts, you do not see a man paralyzed by empathy. He is not weeping for every corpse from Britannia to Syria.
No.
Instead, you see a man who systematically and ruthlessly shrank his focus. Aurelius excised concern for the chaotic, uncontrollable panic of the empire and focused solely on what he could directly govern.
His own mind.
His own mind, his immediate physical duties, and his rational response to the events unfolding in front of him.
He didn't try to absorb the pain of the whole world. He just shut out the noise.
Riker argues that Marcus Aurelius maintained his sanity and ruled the world precisely by shrinking his focus to what he could directly touch and command. He didn't care about everything.
He triaged his empathy.
Yes, to save what actually mattered. He conserved his mental glucose for the decisions that kept the empire functioning.
Which brings us to the first set of actionable protocols Riker lays out for the listener. How to apply this Stoic framework today. The first one he calls the "Is this my circus?" protocol.
Yeah, it's a method for cutting off that allostatic load.
Right. It acts as this aggressive cognitive filter for daily life.
When faced with any demand for your time, your empathy, or your political outrage, Riker instructs you to pause and ask 3 rigid questions.
Okay, what are they?
First, is this within my physical control? Second, does this directly affect the safety or prosperity of my family? Third, is this within my legal or professional jurisdiction?
And if the answer to those is no.
You discard it completely. You offer no opinion, no emotional reaction, and no mental bandwidth.
Wow, just cut it off.
He describes this process as crushing trivialities beneath the iron boot of rational self-interest.
The iron boot of rational self-interest.
Yeah. If a geopolitical crisis on the other side of the planet doesn't pass that 3-question filter, you do not allow it to spike your cortisol.
It's a total rejection of the modern idea that, like, being informed about everything makes you a good citizen.
Completely rejects it.
The second protocol targets the digital drain directly, the information defense protocol. He prescribes rigid 90-minute blocks of absolute isolation for deep, productive work. And he's intense about the parameters.
Oh, the parameters are non-negotiable in his system. No smartphone in the room.
None.
No unrelated internet tabs open. The physical door to the room must be locked tight. You are creating a synthetic sensory deprivation environment to force the prefrontal cortex to single task.
Because it's so starved for focus.
Right. He emphasizes that you must treat these 90-minute blocks as sacred appointments with your own legacy.
He brings up the Apollo program to illustrate this, which I found really compelling.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
I mean, the men who put human beings on the surface of the moon didn't have Slack channels pinging them every 4 seconds.
No, they did not.
They didn't have open plan offices where anyone could interrupt their train of thought. They had heavy doors, chalkboards, and singular, undeniable focus.
And look what they built.
Exactly. I think we have to ask ourselves, and I'm asking you listening right now, look at your daily workflow. How much of your day is spent passively reacting to digital pings versus actually building something of substance?
Are you an architect of your day or just a respondent to other people's emergencies?
Right. But that question of agency is the pivot point of his analysis. Riker asserts that this scattered, reactive state we find ourselves in isn't an accident of technology.
No. He believes it is the result of a long, deliberate ideological shift.
Yeah, if our biological hardware is being hijacked, we have to ask how the software of our society got so corrupted in the first place.
And that traces the intellectual descent of the West, which Riker maps out in his timeline of what he calls the gynocentric trap.
I want to be careful to lay out his specific definitions here because he doesn't start in the 20th century. He goes all the way back to the French Enlightenment.
He does.
He pinpoints the year 1762 as patient zero for this intellectual pathogen.
1762 is a crucial rupture point in Riker's historical mapping. That is the year the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau published a treatise on education called Emile.
Okay, Emil.
To understand why Riker views this as a pathogen, you have to look at the classical Western tradition that preceded it.
Right, before Rousseau.
Before Rousseau, classical education and philosophy rooted in Aristotle and later Christian theology generally held that human beings had a fixed biological nature.
Which was often flawed, right?
Yes, flawed, and it needed to be disciplined and shaped by rigid moral and rational frameworks.
Right, the idea was that human nature is an objective reality you have to contend with, not something you can just invent out of thin air.
Exactly. But Rousseau's Emile fundamentally broke from that classical pursuit of objective truth. Rousseau introduced the concept of the blank slate and the noble savage.
The idea that we're born perfect.
Exactly, the idea that human beings are born inherently perfect, and that it is the structures of society, rather than nature or biology, that corrupts them and shapes their identity.
And Riker views this as the original fallacy.
He does. Because if society shapes humans entirely, then you can theorize that if you just dismantle the existing society, you can engineer a perfect human.
He argues that this idea set the stage for all the social engineering experiments that followed.
Yep.
He traces that lineage forward, watching it combine with Marxist theories of class struggle and eventually morphing into modern critical theory. And this brings him to his primary target in the 20th century.
The 1960s feminist movement.
Specifically pointing to Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique.
Riker does not mince words when discussing the feminine mystique. He describes its publication and widespread adoption as initiating the greatest historical bait and switch of the 20th century.
Bait and switch.
Yeah. To contextualize his claim, Friedan's book argues that the post-World War II nuclear family structure was essentially a comfortable concentration camp for women, stifling their true potential.
And what is Riker's counterinterpretation of that domestic sphere? Because he strongly disagrees.
In Riker's framework, the traditional domestic sphere was not a prison, but rather the essential crucible of Western civilizational stability.
Okay.
He argues that Friedan's text functioned as a psychological wedge that convinced millions of women to abandon the patriarchal family structure.
He claims it severed women from their biological imperative of family building.
Yes, child rearing, convincing them to exchange the sovereignty of the home for what he terms the empty mechanistic drudgery of corporate wage slavery.
Wow. So he's arguing that the pursuit of domestic tranquility and family legacy was replaced by a capitalistic hamster wheel.
And sold to the public under the guise of empowerment.
But how did this philosophy completely capture academia and our modern institutions? Like, why didn't the traditional frameworks hold their ground?
Riker places the blame for institutional capture on a philosophical tool called standpoint epistemology.
Okay, standpoint epistemology.
This is a postmodern academic concept asserting that objective truth simply does not exist.
So there are no facts.
Right. Instead, it posits that truth is entirely subjective and is inextricably linked to the power dynamics and victimhood status of the speaker.
Ah.
Under this framework, lived experience, specifically the lived experience of marginalized groups, overrides empirical data.
Meaning you can't challenge an argument with data if the person making the argument claims a higher status of historical oppression.
Exactly.
He literally refers to modern HR departments, diversity boards, and academia as a citation cartel.
He uses that term deliberately. I mean, a cartel controls a market.
Yeah.
Riker claims these institutions operate as an incestuous echo chamber.
They just cite each other.
Yes, they write papers citing each other's subjective theories, creating a closed loop of academic validation without ever anchoring their research in measurable, empirical, or biological reality.
Wow.
By bypassing Aristotelian logic and the scientific method, they can enforce policies based purely on ideology.
But eventually, ideology has to crash into the physical world, right?
It always does.
To illustrate what happens when these socially constructed theories collide with objective biological reality, Riker unpacks a very specific, extensive data point.
The Swedish gender-neutral preschool experiment.
Yes. I want to walk through the mechanics of this because it's a profound case study in social engineering. What exactly did the Swedish state attempt to do?
The timeline spans a couple of decades. Starting around 1998, Sweden began implementing a radical gender-neutral preschool curriculum.
Okay.
And by 2018, they had expanded it aggressively with significant state funding. The premise, built heavily on the Rousseauian idea we just discussed, was that gender differences in children are entirely the result of societal conditioning.
So boys only like trucks because we give them trucks.
That's their theory. Therefore, the state attempted to forcefully redirect children's natural inclinations.
Wait, isn't the standard counter-argument there that gender roles are mostly just socialization? Like, the theory is that if you take away the toy trucks from the boys and the dolls from the girls, shouldn't they just naturally adapt and play identically?
Well, what actually happened when the teachers tried to enforce that is telling.
What did they do?
The methods of enforcement were quite rigid. Teachers were instructed to ban words like boy and girl, use gender-neutral pronouns, and actively intervene to stop natural play patterns.
Actively intervene.
Yes. For instance, they would interrupt boys who engaged in natural, boisterous rough-and-tumble play, forcing them to sit quietly and engage in cooperative, passive activities.
Riker refers to this as forcing boys into female-coded modes of being, right?
Yes, an attempt to legislate away millions of years of sexually dimorphic biological development.
And the biological pushback from the children, what did the researchers actually record? Because you can't just legislate biology away.
By 2019, researchers at Uppsala University, alongside other child psychologists observing the cohort, began publishing data that demonstrated the catastrophic failure of this social engineering.
Catastrophic failure.
The study showed that forcing children into this artificially flattened, gender-neutral environment did not create harmony.
What did it create?
It caused severe psychological stress, anxiety, and confusion, particularly in the boys. Observers noted spikes in cortisol and behavioral acting out because the boys were being systemically punished for their natural biological impulses.
Wow.
Riker uses this vast social experiment to argue a core tenet of his philosophy. Nature and biology will not be mocked by Marxist academics.
Right.
He argues that trying to mandate that men and women are identical, interchangeable cogs, leads directly to psychological damage and eventually systemic civilizational collapse.
Let's follow that thread regarding the flattening of society, because I want to challenge Riker's view on hierarchy versus equality. The prevailing modern consensus across almost all institutions is that equality, specifically equality of outcome, is the ultimate moral good.
That's the narrative.
But Riker seems to say that the ideological drive for absolute equality isn't just misguided, he says it is actually lethal. And he brings up the agricultural history of the Soviet Union to prove his point.
He does. In Riker's framework, hierarchies are not socially constructed tools of systemic oppression, which is the Marxist view. Riker views hierarchies as the natural biological engine of human excellence and competence.
Okay, so competence creates the hierarchy naturally.
Exactly. He argues that competence naturally stratifies a society.
Yeah.
When a state tries to artificially enforce absolute equality across a population, he says you don't eliminate the hierarchy, you simply drive it underground, where it becomes pathologically corrupt.
The specific historical example he uses is the kulaks. Who were they, and how did the pursuit of equality destroy them?
In the early 20th century, during the formation of the Soviet Union, the kulaks were essentially the most successful, innovative, and productive peasant farmers in Russia and Ukraine.
The best farmers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because they were competent, they owned a little more land or perhaps a few more cattle than their neighbors. When the Bolsheviks took power, driven by what Riker calls the envy of the competent, they applied the Marxist lens.
So they didn't see them as good farmers.
No. They didn't see the kulaks as hard workers who were feeding the nation. They saw them as class enemies and oppressors, simply because they were at the top of the local agricultural hierarchy.
So in the name of leveling the playing field and achieving absolute equality, the state targeted them.
The state demonized them, confiscated their property, sent hundreds of thousands to the gulags, and executed the rest.
Unbelievable.
But eliminating the competent tier of society did not create a utopia of equals. The immediate agricultural fallout was a catastrophic man-made famine, including the Holodomor in Ukraine, where millions starved to death.
All because the people who actually knew how to farm had been liquidated.
Precisely.
And did it even achieve the equality it promised for the survivors?
Not at all. And this is Riker's ultimate point about the hypocrisy of enforced equality. It simply created a new, ruthless, and entirely corrupt elite called the nomenklatura.
A nomenclature.
This was the bureaucratic class of the Communist Party. This new, corrupt hierarchy enjoyed massive privileges.
While everyone else starved.
They shopped in exclusive, heavily guarded, state-run Gosplan stores that were stocked with imported Western luxuries, fresh meats, and fine clothes. Meanwhile, the ordinary citizens they claimed to be making equal were literally freezing and starving to death in block-long bread lines.
Wow.
Riker uses this historical tragedy to argue that the violent pursuit of equality always results in a ruthless aristocracy of bureaucrats.
That is a very heavy, blood-soaked historical parallel. So if modern society is constantly pushing this narrative of systemic oppression, telling people they are victims of invisible hierarchies, how does that affect the psychology of the individual man today?
Well, this is where Riker transitions into the psychology of struggle and rejecting the victim cult.
To explain the psychological damage caused by a constant diet of victimhood narratives, Riker turns to a foundational behavioral psychology experiment from 1975, conducted by Martin Seligman.
Oh, the learned helplessness study.
Yes, it is the famous learned helplessness study. This is the experiment with the dogs in the shuttle boxes. Explain the setup, because the mechanism of how the brain adapts to trauma here is critical.
So Seligman placed dogs in an enclosure with a floor that could deliver electric shocks. The first group of dogs had a mechanism, like a panel they could press, to stop the shock.
Okay, so they had control.
Yes, they quickly learned to control their environment. The second group, however, was subjected to inescapable, randomized electric shock.
Inescapable.
No matter what they did, they could not stop the pain. After a period of time, once the animals' brains internalized that they had absolutely no agency or control over the voltage, they simply gave up.
They literally laid down and took it. But the really terrifying part is what happened in the next phase of the experiment.
Precisely. In the next phase, Seligman took those same dogs who had been conditioned to feel helpless and placed them in a new box. This time, he provided a very simple escape route, a low partition dividing the box.
So they could just leave.
All the dog had to do to escape the shock was easily jump over the small barrier to the safe side. But the dogs from the inescapable shock group didn't even try.
They didn't even try.
No. The prior conditioning had so deeply rewired their brains that they refused to act. They just lay there on the grid and passively absorbed the voltage, even though freedom was inches away.
And Riker maps this biological surrender directly onto the minds of modern men.
He maps it onto what he defines as the leftist syllogism of slavery.
The leftist syllogism of slavery.
Riker argues that modern state-sponsored media, academia, and political propaganda operate like that inescapable shock grid. They constantly scream about invisible, omnipresent, and invincible forces of systemic oppression, patriarchy, or late-stage capitalism.
So the narrative constantly tells young men that the economic and social systems are completely rigged against them from birth.
Exactly.
So by convincing a man that his failures are caused by massive external systems he can't possibly control, you induce that same learned helplessness.
Exactly. Riker believes this is a deliberate sociological trap designed to neuter male agency. If you convince a demographic that effort is futile because the game is rigged, they stop trying to jump the fence.
They just lie on the grid.
They surrender their ambitions, retreat into digital escapism, and ultimately they just complain and beg the state for equity and intervention.
It's literally a mechanism to make people accept the shock. And Riker contrasts this modern fragility, this intense desire for safe spaces and trigger warnings, with how humans historically handled real, objective adversity.
He points out that the modern cultural imperative demands a frictionless existence. It strives to create a sterile safe space, devoid of harsh language, offensive ideas, or physical hardship.
But history mocks this intense aversion to struggle, doesn't it?
Yes. Riker brings us back to the arrival of the Yersinia pestis bacterium in Europe in 1347. That plague wiped out half the continent. It was an era of unimaginable, grotesque horror, with mass graves and total societal upheaval.
Right, our hook for the episode.
Yet the survivors of that era didn't demand trigger warnings or retreat into apathy. They processed the trauma, reorganized their societies, and built the Renaissance.
Built the Renaissance from the ashes.
Riker argues that a frictionless society, one that attempts to legislate away all intellectual and physical hardship, doesn't protect men. It literally dissolves their structural, psychological integrity. A muscle that encounters zero resistance simply atrophies.
So how does a man navigate this? I mean, if the world is chaotic and the media is trying to induce learned helplessness, how do you figure out what to actually fight for and what to ignore?
Riker visualizes this using an incredibly practical tool he calls the dichotomy of control matrix.
Okay, let's break this down.
It's a very helpful mental model derived from Epictetus. Picture a standard graph. The y-axis represents your level of objective control over a situation, ranging from high at the top to low at the bottom.
Okay, and the x-axis?
The x-axis represents your internal emotional investment, also from high to low.
Okay, I'm visualizing the 4 quadrants. Break them down for us.
Quadrant 1, the top right, is high control and high emotional investment. Riker called this the domain of mastery.
Mastery, what fits in there?
This includes your physical fitness, the acquisition of high-value skills, your daily routine, and your immediate conduct toward your family. This is the only territory where a patrician mind should live.
Okay, and then you have quadrant 2.
Quadrant 2 in the bottom right, which is low control but high emotional investment.
So having a massive amount of emotional investment in things you have absolutely zero power to change, like arguing on the internet.
Exactly. Riker calls this the delusion zone. This is where he says the modern NPC zombie spends their entire life.
The NPCs.
They are screaming at the sky about macro political outcomes, celebrity court cases, and global economic shifts. They have zero tangible power to influence.
Because they invest all their limited cognitive energy outside their jurisdiction.
Yes. They have no glucose or willpower left for the territory they actually govern, leaving their own lives in shambles.
To make the mechanics of this even clearer, he uses a poker analogy, contrasting it with chess. Because a lot of people think of life strategy like chess, right?
They do.
You analyze the board, make a move, and there is a deterministic outcome. But Riker says life is absolutely not chess. Life is high-stakes poker.
The distinction is vital. In chess, you have perfect information. You can see all the pieces on the board.
Everything is visible.
In poker, you are dealing with imperfect information, hidden variables, and a massive amount of variance and luck. You only control two things in poker: the discipline of your betting strategy and how you play the cards you are dealt.
You don't control the river card.
You do not control the river card that flips over, and you do not control the twitching tells or the irrational bets of the other players at the table. Riker argues that a master plays his hand with iron discipline, accepts the variance without emotional collapse, and folds the rest.
Fold the rest. And to help people internalize this stoic separation between input and outcome, he attaches a very visceral physical protocol, the paper burning protocol.
Yeah, this is intense.
He tells the reader to get a physical piece of paper and literally draw a line down the center. On the left side, you write down the specific inputs and actions you control today, your workout, the hours you spend building your business, the pages you read.
Mastery quadrant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On the right side, you write down the external results you desire: massive wealth, a promotion, how other people perceive you. And then he instructs you to take a lighter and burn the right side of the paper to ash.
Just burn it.
I want the listener to really think about that for a second. Think about the liberating psychological release of watching your uncontrollable anxieties, the need for external validation, literally turn to ash, leaving you holding only the inputs you actually command.
That physical act of destruction provides a tactile reinforcement of a mental boundary, which perfectly transitions into Riker's fourth major concept.
The power of boundaries and what he calls the NPC phenomenon.
Yes.
This might be where he uses his most aggressive metaphor in the entire book. When discussing boundaries, he says a man without them is like a public restroom.
It's a jarring image, but it sticks in your head.
It really does. It's incredibly provocative.
It is intentionally provocative, but the underlying psychological point is profound. A public restroom is open to anyone, used by everyone, and respected by no one.
Wow.
His point is clear. If you are completely accessible, if you consume every piece of media placed in front of you, and if you do not define a rigid intellectual border, you are utterly devoid of psychological sovereignty.
They're just open.
He argues that if you don't aggressively define your mental perimeter, the ideological mob simply walks in, sets up camp, and rewrites your operating system.
And this complete lack of a perimeter is what creates the NPC phenomenon, non-playable characters. He borrows this from video game culture. How does he define an NPC in the real world?
Riker defines an NPC as a human being who has effectively lost or surrendered their internal monologue.
Because they have built no mental walls or filters.
Exactly. Ideological possession spreads through them like a viral contagion. They do not arrive at conclusions through independent Aristotelian logic. They simply download the latest software update from the media or academia.
Like a hive mind.
They operate as a synchronized hive mind, their vocabulary limited to approved buzzwords, and their outrage perfectly artificially synchronized.
He provides a crazy real-world example of this kind of synchronized top-down linguistic programming. He points to the June 2020 AP Style Book Directive. Let's look at the mechanics of how language rewires perception here.
That directive was a pivotal moment for Riker's analysis of institutional capture.
The AP Style Book.
The Associated Press Style Book essentially dictates the grammar, vocabulary, and framing for the vast majority of American institutional media. In June 2020, amidst widespread civil unrest, the AP issued a directive instructing journalists to avoid using the word riot.
Wait, avoid using the word riot.
Yes, the justification provided was that the word riot suggests uncontrolled chaos and stigmatizes the events.
Even when the events being covered involve buildings literally burning to the ground and widespread looting, you can see the flames on the camera, but the reporter is forbidden from calling it a riot.
Exactly. Riker views this as a blatant attempt to use linguistic manipulation to override visual objective reality.
If they control the language, they control the reality.
If an institution can control the vocabulary you are allowed to use, they control the perimeter of acceptable thought. If you cannot name the chaos, you cannot mentally process or defend against it.
So, what is the historical counterexample to this borderless, manipulated chaos? How did classical leaders establish boundaries? He points to Rome again, specifically the logistical and psychological triumph of Emperor Hadrian.
In the year 122 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian stood at the absolute northern edge of the known civilized world in Britannia.
Right.
Instead of trying to endlessly push the borders into the chaotic wilderness, he ordered the construction of a 73-mile-long, heavily fortified stone wall across the entire width of the island.
Building that in 122 AD is a staggering logistical achievement. But Riker isn't just impressed by the masonry. He's focused on the psychological impact of the wall.
Riker emphasizes that Hadrian didn't build the wall to prevent all interaction or trade. He built it to definitively establish exactly where Rome ended and barbarism began.
A psychological boundary.
It was a physical manifestation of a psychological boundary. The Romans inside the wall knew exactly what laws governed them, and they knew the chaos stayed on the other side.
They're on the wilderness.
That single brilliant act of civilizational boundary setting secured 300 years of internal stability for that sector of the empire. Riker demands that modern men must build a mental Hadrian's Wall.
A mental Hadrian's Wall. And he gives us the Hadrian Protocol to execute that in our own lives. It is ruthlessly practical.
Extremely practical.
You audit your social circle, identify the 3 people in your life who drain your energy the most, the chronic complainers, the emotional vampires, and you limit your engagement with them to exactly 15 minutes per interaction.
Just 15 minutes.
You craft a polite, robotic script to exit the conversation, you state your limit, and you enforce the border. He argues it's not cruelty, it is necessary psychological architecture.
He pairs that defensive strategy with an offensive intellectual test called the mirror neuron defense.
Okay, what is that?
Because Riker believes ideological possession is a communicable disease spread through emotional contagion and linguistic repetition, he challenges the reader to test the structural integrity of their own intellectual sovereignty.
This is the 30-minute challenge. I tried this, and it is incredibly difficult.
The protocol is simple but agonizing. You locate the most formidable, articulate opponent of your strongest political or philosophical conviction.
The person you disagree with most.
You sit down, and you spend 30 uninterrupted minutes reading or listening to their argument without muttering a single internal rebuttal. You do not construct counter-arguments in your head. You just absorb their logic.
That is so hard to do.
Riker argues that if you cannot articulate your opponent's position persuasively enough to convince a neutral observer that you believe it, then you don't actually understand the debate.
You're just parroting.
If you can only parrot your side's talking points, you're just an NPC in someone else's script.
That is a brutal mirror to hold up. If you can't state the enemy's case, your own case is weak. Okay, so in Riker's framework, we've built the walls, we've shut out the noise, and we've audited our intellectual honesty. In the next section, the focus shifts entirely to the micro level.
Finding meaning in the mundane and systemic self-governance.
Yes. This transition is where Riker connects the philosophical to the biological. He argues that mastering your daily mundane routine is the active, physical rejection of external chaos.
Because you cannot control the macro collapse of societal institutions, but you possess absolute authority over the microenvironment of your daily life.
And he backs this assertion up with some serious psychological literature, notably Roy Baumeister's landmark work on willpower. Let's delve into ego depletion theory here.
In 2005, the social psychologist Roy Baumeister published a massive landmark review that analyzed data from over 18,000 studies regarding human behavior.
18,000 studies.
He was studying the mechanics of willpower, which he termed ego depletion. The conclusion of this massive data set was undeniable. Self-regulation and self-control are the single strongest predictors of positive life outcomes.
Wait, more than raw intelligence, more than the socioeconomic background you were born into.
It absolutely crushes IQ and background. A highly intelligent person with no self-regulation will consistently fail, while a person of average intelligence with immense self-control can systematically build an empire.
That is fascinating.
Riker uses Baumeister's data to prove that the Patrician mind isn't something you were born with. It is built through the relentless friction of systematic self-governance. He also cites fMRI studies conducted by neuroscientist Sarah Lazar, also around 2005, to show the physical mechanism of this discipline.
These are the mindfulness studies. But Riker strips away any of the mystical yoga retreat connotations usually associated with mindfulness. What did the fMRI scans actually reveal about the brain structure?
Lazar's research demonstrated neuroplasticity in action. When subjects engaged in sustained, focused attention, forcing their brain to concentrate on a single present-moment task, the fMRI scans showed that they literally physically thickened the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex.
The seat of rational executive function.
Exactly. Simultaneously, the sustained focus shrank the amygdala, which is the primitive brain center responsible for fear, anxiety, and emotional reactivity.
So the act of intense focus physically upgrades the brain's hardware. You are literally building armor against anxiety.
Precisely. Riker views this deliberate structural alteration of the brain as neurobiological warfare against the feminized hysteria of modernity.
Neurobiological warfare.
Training your focus on small, controllable things physically builds the biological hardware necessary for a man to lead.
I love the historical example he brings in to illustrate this microdiscipline. George Washington. In 1748, when Washington was just a 16-year-old surveyor, long before he commanded armies or founded a nation, he meticulously copied down 110 rules of civility and decent behavior.
And Riker highlights Rule 49 specifically.
Rule 49 commands one to labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience.
Such a great quote.
It is. And Riker argues that the young Washington wasn't just being a pedantic, obedient rule follower. By forcing himself to govern the minutiae of his daily posture, speech, and interactions, Washington was aggressively constructing a sovereign, unshakable character through daily, mundane discipline.
He was building the prefrontal cortex that would later withstand the freezing winter at Valley Forge.
Which gives us the mundane protocol. Riker says you have to select one simple, repetitive physical act every single day. Making a pour-over coffee, washing a cast iron skillet, or disassembling and cleaning a firearm.
And you must perform it with the tyrannical focus of a Roman statesman.
You have to register 5 specific sensory details. If it's the coffee, you feel the ceramic weight of the mug, you listen to the acoustic frequency of the water hitting the grind, you register the thermal shift in the wood.
Smell of the roast, the texture of the filter.
Exactly. By mastering the immediate physical reality of the moment, you anchor your neurobiology. You create a physical tether that stops you from drifting into the subjective, ideological anxieties of the outside world.
It grounds you completely.
But, I want to push back a bit on this with an analogy, because modern self-help, the kind of advice you see all over social media, constantly tells us to take a break, to give yourself grace, or that a messy room is just a sign of a creative mind.
Right.
But Riker demands rigid, almost exhausting discipline over your immediate environment. It makes me think about the state of a person's workspace. I'll ask you, listening right now. Look at your desk right now. Does a messy desk reflect a messy mind?
Well, in Riker's framework, yes.
If you can't govern the placement of your own coffee cup, how can you possibly expect to govern your life, let alone resist what he views as societal brainwashing?
Riker's response to the modern self-help movement would be scathing. He argues that giving yourself grace is often just a euphemism for surrendering to entropy.
Entropy, yeah.
He would say that if you refuse to govern your own impulses and your immediate physical surroundings, you forfeit your right to govern anything else. And that localized governance brings us to his final expansive segment.
Crafting legacy and the fall of Rome. How does all this micro-discipline, this boundary setting, and this resistance to the allostatic load translate into a macro legacy?
He starts this section with an incredible historical anecdote about Alfred Nobel, the Swedish chemist who invented dynamite.
It is a profound story of course correction. In 1888, Alfred Nobel's brother Ludwig died in France. But a French newspaper made a catastrophic journalistic error and published Alfred's obituary instead.
The headline read, Le marchand de la mort est mort. The merchant of death is dead.
The merchant of death is dead.
The obituary went on to condemn him for inventing a way to kill more people faster than ever before in human history.
Imagine waking up, drinking your coffee, opening the paper, and reading your own obituary, only to realize that the world universally despises you and will remember you only as a purveyor of slaughter.
Riker calls it the ultimate nightmare of the unarchitected man, but it served as a brutal psychological shock.
It changed everything for him.
It prompted Nobel to completely pivot his life's trajectory. He realized the horror of his unintended legacy and used his agency and his vast fortune to rewrite it by establishing the Nobel Prizes.
Ensuring he would be remembered for rewarding the highest achievements in human excellence and peace. Why does Riker think modern men are so bad at doing this proactively today? Why do we drift until it's too late?
He points to the modern cultural approach to mortality. Modernity tries to hide death. Riker references terror management theory, originally established by Greenberg in 1986, and couples it with a fascinating 2015 Stanford study led by Susan Erickson.
The Erickson study.
Erickson's study demonstrated that when participants are forced to confront their legacy and their mortality directly, when they are reminded that their time is finite, they make decisions that are aligned with their deep stated values 67% more often.
So confronting the reality of death actually optimizes the brain's executive function. It cuts through the procrastination.
Exactly. The awareness of death forces prioritization. But Riker argues that modern culture, with its endless digital distractions and medical sanitization of death, is designed to anesthetize you into believing you have infinite time.
Which keeps you docile.
When a man truly internalizes his own mortality, it violently strips away the trivialities. He stops caring about the AP style book or Twitter outrage because he realizes he has a legacy to build before the clock runs out.
He gives what I think is the ultimate modern example of this with the story of Pat Tillman.
Pat Tillman is Riker's quintessential case study in choosing objective historical meaning over modern manufactured comfort.
Following the 9/11 attacks, Tillman was sitting at the absolute peak of the modern entertainment spectacle.
He was a starting safety in the NFL.
Holding a $3.6 million contract, he had fame, wealth, and status, yet he walked away from all of it, declining the money and the adoration, to enlist as an Army Ranger. He deployed to combat zones and was tragically killed in Afghanistan in 2004.
And while critics might look at that and call it a tragic waste of potential, Riker sees it entirely differently.
How does he frame it?
Riker views Tillman's decision as the supreme, objective choice to prioritize duty, masculine virtue, and legacy over what he calls the feminine-coded adoration of sports entertainment. Tillman refused to be an NPC in a game. He forged his own objective meaning in the arena of reality.
It is the ultimate embodiment of Theodore Roosevelt's famous 1910 Man in the Arena speech delivered in Paris. Riker uses that speech as a weapon against the modern critic.
Roosevelt's speech drew a sharp, unforgiving line between the man whose face is marred by dust, sweat, and blood, the man who actually strives to do the deeds and risks failure, and the cold and timid souls in the stands who know neither victory nor defeat.
And Riker identifies those cheering, jeering mobs in the stands as the exact prototype of today's ideological critic.
Yes.
These are the people who cower on the sidelines of social media, demanding you apologize for your ambition and tearing down historical monuments precisely because they are utterly incapable of achieving greatness themselves.
And if the men capable of building don't return to the arena and ignore the critics, Riker warns we are facing an inevitable civilizational collapse. He draws a direct historical parallel to the year 410 AD.
410 AD marks the sack of Rome by King Alaric and the Visigoths. It was a moment of absolute, terrifying failure of internal order.
But Riker points out that the walls weren't breached by superior barbarian technology. The city gates were opened from the inside.
Opened from the inside.
Riker claims Rome collapsed because its leaders and men had long since abandoned stoic pragmatism and military discipline for a gynocentric obsession with bread, circuses, and political appeasement.
He literally says we are living through a second sack of Rome, an institutional collapse orchestrated by subjective moral relativism and the rejection of objective competence.
And in the traumatic wake of that original sack, the philosopher Augustine of Hippo wrote his masterpiece, The City of God, in 426 AD. Augustine offered a masterclass in how to navigate the ruins of a dying world without being consumed by its hysteria.
Which is exactly what Riker is trying to do here.
Riker's ultimate message is that modern men must adopt this Augustinian mindset. They must act as the Stoic architects of the future, preserving the classical foundations of order amidst the current cultural ruins.
Which brings us to his final and perhaps most intense protocol, the Nobel audit. Riker challenges the reader to ruthlessly audit their last 12 months of existence. Look at your browser history, your credit card and bank statements, your daily work output, and your calendar.
It's brutal.
If an entirely impartial press published your obituary tomorrow morning based strictly on that empirical data, what would the headline read? Would it say, "Another worthless consumer dies"? Or would it say, "A builder has fallen"?
It's a brutal metric for measuring the distance between the man you claim to be in your head and the man your daily actions prove you are. It strips away all self-deception. It demands total, uncompromising accountability.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, deconstructing the biological, historical, and psychological architecture laid out in Patrician Mind. If you want to dive deeper into this ongoing philosophical warfare and intellectual insurgency, you absolutely need to follow the author on Substack at Conrad Riker.
For those interested in exploring these classical frameworks further, the author provides a continuous stream of material and practical protocols on that platform.
And as we wrap up, a forceful reminder to our listeners, grab your own copy of Patrician Mind right now. Head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook today. Leaving a 5-star review is what Riker calls a digital sword strike against algorithmic suppression. It's a way to signal to the market that these ideas won't be silenced.
Go get it.
And make sure you like and subscribe to our deep dive here too, so we can keep bringing you these breakdowns.
We've examined Riker's intricate roadmap for preparing for what he sees as the collapse of society by rigorously mastering our own minds in neurobiology. But I want to leave you with a final lingering thought that builds on this entire Stoic philosophy we discussed today.
What's that?
Consider this paradox. What if the ultimate, most devastating act of rebellion against a screaming, chaotic world isn't to scream back, but simply to stand in your kitchen in absolute silence and intentionally feel the weight of your coffee mug? Think about that.